I'm Professor Erkki Huhtamo. I was just visiting Paris. I walked down Rue Vivienne. On my left-hand side, number 29, I saw the Théâtre de Vaudeville, and on the right-hand side I saw the Bourse Stock Exchange, and I was walking towards the Boulevard Montmartre. But it was not exactly the Paris you would experience today. There were no cars, not even bicycles, but there were people walking, and there were some horses with their carts. And I used this device as my time machine. This device is known as Diorama Miniatures, or the miniature diorama. Peep media is one of the important traditions, ways of watching images, optical media. It's something else than a magic lantern show where there's usually a group of people, an audience, just like in the movie theaters today. Peep media could be related with also other forms of media, and this is exactly what happened with devices like the Diorama Miniatures. Its inspiration was the diorama as a public spectacle that had been opened in Paris in 1822 by two scene painters, Charles-Marie Bouton and Louis Daguerre. It was one of the ultimate sights of Paris until it burned down in 1839. In the 19th century there were many forms, and as the home was becoming a center for consumption, these devices found many forms. This, for example, this rusty little tube here is so-called lorgnette pittoresque. This time the images are round. You have a view again, in this case Paris, you put it in here, you would Peep, and you have an interesting example. You would actually go to a shop and you would get this kind of a folder containing 6 views. But there were also other forms, and these forms, as I mentioned, took the peeping to public spaces. These shows were more elaborate, they had bigger boxes. And I want to talk about peep media in culture, its meanings, by next taking you to the inner chamber of my media archaeology cabinet. We are now at the inner chamber of my cabinet, and I would like to show you some of the earlier peep show machines in my collection. The first one is a touring showman's box from the late 18th century. It has a lens, and behind the lens there is a mirror in a 45-degree angle. The views are placed here at the bottom, and actually they are operated by these cranks on both sides. The views are on a row, a series of pictures from great cities and other interesting geographical locations around the world. This type of peep show machine was popular for a long time. In the 18th century, 19th century, you could also find them in private homes, wealthy homes I have to add. For example, the one behind me is much like that, except that it would never be taken out from the salon. So the pictures that were typically shown inside 18th century peep show boxes were like this one. These were known as vue d'optique or perspective views, often about cities or palaces, or sometimes also events like wars or earthquakes and so on. These were also used in a slightly different kind of a device, which I have right here behind me, which is called the Stereoscope, or the diagonal optical mirror. The view would be placed on the table behind the device and seen exactly like in a peep show box. What's different is that in the peep show, the immersive experience was an important part of that. Here it is different because the structure is skeletal. You can actually see the picture, and when you look through the lenses, you can actually see how that illusion and the deep perspective space is created. So in the 18th century there were huge varieties of this kind of a peep show pictures. They were made in several cities around Europe, thousands and thousands, and they were popular because most people had few chances of traveling, so this virtual travel, visiting all these great places, was important. Also, these images were often treated in highly complex ways, so to add some kind of special effects. So linking them with the kind of virtual reality travels we can experience through head-mounted displays, or even the internet these days, is not a wrong idea. I'm going to demonstrate to you peep show that would have been shown in fairs at Holland in the second half of the 18th century. This peep show box is basically like a miniature theater. We have clouds which are much like from a Baroque theater. We have reflectors with candles at the back for illumination. And the views that go inside, like this one, which is a scene from a theater, have been treated specially from the back side. So there are painted spots, and then there are pinprick holes, and this is all meant to make that view highly bright and illuminated when it's placed inside the peep show box. So in the 19th century there were really many forms of peep media, and quite a few of them could be experienced in the homes. One of the earliest ones was the Kaleidoscope, a device that is still being made, like in the thousands. Kaleidoscope was introduced in the around 1817, and in 1818 it created a huge mania. People couldn't get enough peeking into this kind of a picture tubes and looking at abstract configurations of pieces of colored glass. But the Kaleidoscope was not only a plaything. It was also meant to be a practical device, especially used in clothing industry for designing new kind of fabrics. There were many little varieties, and the one funny one was the so-called peep egg. Peep egg was often sold as a souvenir. It was made out of alabaster, which lets the light through. So you have a little magnifying lens, and then you turn these knobs and you see scenes of some sites. This particular one is from Watkins Glen. So there are album and photographs, and then there is also a very surrealist looking scene made out of grains of sand and pieces of moss and things. They look very huge when you look at them from so close through this magnifying lens. But none of these forms of like domestic peep media was as popular as stereoscopy. So the habit of watching three-dimensional photographs. The idea was introduced for the large crowds at the Crystal Palace exhibitions of the first World's Fair in London in 1851. And very quickly it started spreading. So companies started producing stereoscopic photographs in huge quantities, pictures like these ones, and also selling and designing viewing devices for these. So the viewing devices came in a wide range of styles. Some of them were very expensive, but others were much more affordable too. So the original viewer that people would have seen in the 1850s was of this type. This is a so-called Brewster Viewer. And it's interesting that Sir David Brewster, the Scottish scientist who came up with this design, was actually also the father of the Kaleidoscope. So a great man in the world of Peep media. So what do we have? We have two magnifying lenses, and then we have a box that takes views. In this particular case, this is a French one from the late 19th century. The view is actually a color stereo view. So there are two pictures that look very much the same, but they are slightly different. So they have been taken from positions that sort of like correspond with the so-called parallax difference of our eyes. So we see as if we would be looking at that side, and the lenses help us seeing this in 3D. So there's a matte glass at the back, and at the top there is a mirror for reflecting the light inside the box. Soon the designers started coming up with more complicated viewers, and one example would be this device here, which is the so-called Cadwell viewer. This is from the United States from the 1870s. What makes this device different is the fact that it actually takes a large number of these views inside. So there is a kind of a carousel inside, and I peep into this kind of a hood, and then can basically concentrate on these separate views. It's also easy to change the views by opening the cover and sort of like placing more in. And there's also another funny feature is that this eyepiece that I'm peeping into swivels. So this means you can put these views back to back, so you can store even more inside, and someone else can view it from the other side. But these kind of devices were still for the wealthier part of the population. In the second half of the 19th century, this version gained great popularity. This is the so-called Holmes Viewer. And you can still actually find this from antique stores or flea markets or eBay. This is a very simple design by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was an American medical doctor, intellectual, and a stereoscope enthusiast. So you see that the structure in this kind of device is very skeletal, simple, and also cheap to make. So the views would be placed on a kind of a sliding kind of a platform and peeped through the lens in such a way. And these kind of viewers made their way by 1900 to many working class homes as well. They were also sent home by immigrants to the United States to their home countries, like my home country, Finland. And by 1900, these could be found from and actually made in countries like Japan already. So these forms of stereoscopy anticipated later waves of 3D. And one of the later forms that is very familiar would be the so-called Viewmaster. This device is from the 1950s. So here the innovation was simply that the 3D picture pairs were created on 16mm color film and placed within this kind of a reel. So when you place the reel inside the viewer, and so you can actually see a series of picture, 3D pictures. This is still, of course, familiar with many people in our time. So the important point to keep in mind is that even though Victorian era was a great period for sort of like 3D picture enthusiasm, it hasn't disappeared anyway. So it keeps on coming in kind of waves, and right recently with all this interest in virtual reality, head-mounted displays, so we are riding on the crest of another 3D wave. So in the 19th century, there were also public forms of Peep media. First of all, there was the Cosmorama, which was very popular. It was a public salon, which had lenses in the walls. And behind the lenses, there were illuminated pictures. So people would pay entrance fee, and then they would move from one lens to another around the hall. This idea influenced the so-called kinetoscope parlor in the late 19th century. That had to do with the coming of the celluloid-based moving pictures. So Thomas Edison invented something called the kinetoscope. This was a peep show machine. So there was a film running in an endless loop inside that machine. Kinetoscope in itself was not very successful. So Edison quickly switched to projecting moving images on the screen. But there were other devices that actually survived very well. And one of them was this device that I have here. This is the so-called Mutoscope. It was a competing machine. This one is from 1898. It's a British model. And these were placed in public spaces, for example, amusement piers and also this kind of early amusement arcades. So basically, what we have? So we have inside a reel of pictures, and we have a hand crank, and we have a hole for money. So nothing happens if I lose my penny. So I have a penny, so let me put it inside this hole, and then you start cranking, and light is lit. And then you can actually watch a movie. And this movie comes from a reel of film clips, a bit like a huge flip book. And obviously what happened is that people were enjoying this idea of this physical cranking. And this is one reason why I have been calling these Mutoscope machines proto-interactive media. You couldn't do very much. You could actually make it faster, like I'm doing now, or you could actually stop it at certain frames that you may have enjoyed perfectly well, and then at some point it would stop. You would have to put another coin. In the 20s, the Mutoscope company actually tried to introduce a different kind of machine, which I have here. And if you look at the front, you see there's no crank. All right, so there's a motor, just like in Edison's original kinetoscope inside. And people didn't like it. It disappeared very quickly. And that means that the idea of interactive relationship with these devices probably plays an important role in the history. And we can actually find it from this very fascinating device, which I have here, which is called Kinora. This was originally invention of the French Lumière brothers, so the film pioneers. But it was very close to the Mutoscope, so they soon went into contract, with the owners of that company, and started producing these basically tiny Mutoscope machines for the home. And for many people, this kind of device was the very first moving picture experience in terms of like photographic, cinematographic movies in the home. So basically what you do, you just do exactly the same as in the microscope. You turn a crank and you can watch movies. The interesting thing about the Kinora is that many early silent films have disappeared. So they were nitrate stock. But these copies that were made on these kind of very durable Kinora reels, like the one that I'm cranking here, have survived. And so many of those early films were preserved for the future viewers. So Peep media was a huge thing in the 18th and 19th centuries. It served many purposes. One of them was virtual traveling by means of pictures. There were also erotic pictures, but we don't know always so much of those anymore because they were secret images. Peep media hasn't disappeared. We can find many forms in our culture. For example, let's think about the internet, all these kind of windows or doors on the screen that you can open by clicking. Sometimes you have to pay money, with your credit card and so on. And of course, we do have erotic peep shows as well. Peep media is one of the basic forms of media culture. It exists side by side with projections and other things. And we will understand that better when we look in the next part of this series about the ways how images first started moving, the origin, the archaeology of the animated image. So until then, enjoy and goodbye.